lecture is going to be on the Civil War. Civil War is 1861 to 1865. Now, as we talked about in the last lecture, there was basically women's rights issues, and they were in a sense kind of like a huge wave and a huge push of women's rights issue. Kind of settles down in the 1850s. Definitely with the Civil War, the women's rights issues definitely get put on the back burner until after the war. Basically after, I would say, 1870s is when you start to see them kind of pick up the women's rights movement. Because you have the Civil War. The Civil War breaks out. And with any war, women basically just pick up wherever things need to be picked up. They basically pick up for where the men are, and they basically figure out a way to survive through the war years. So overall, the role of the women during the Civil War, whether it's North or South, is to pick up where the men left off. Maintaining the homes, the family businesses, family farms. Women went to other jobs. They actually worked in other jobs. If you're talking about the North, they'll actually work in some factory jobs, fulfilling military orders. They also worked in government offices. The women that worked in government offices were known as government girls. Okay, union specifically, as I kind of already mentioned, if women will go into the factories or the government offices, but if they didn't do that, or maybe on the free time that they had that they could steal away, women would preserve fruit. They would roll bandages. They would sew shirts for the military. Women will work through a lot of church organizations to raise money and donate supplies to the military. 1862 in Weldon, Pennsylvania, the women raised over $17,000 worth of goods that they sent for the military. As I mentioned, some women will work for the federal government or for the government. They're known as government girls. An example of that would be Annie Wittenmeyer, Wittenmeyer, Annie Wittenmeyer of Iowa. She worked to aid society. Well, she worked in aid societies in Iowa in the very beginning. And then she would start to go, and through those aid societies, then she started to go into the military hospitals. And she realized the military hospitals were absolutely horrible. And so she wanted to really focus in and work in military hospitals, in a sense, to try and clean them up. And so she was just trying to make them, and then that tended to be her work during the Civil War, is going into military hospitals for the Union and trying to clean up military hospitals. But she also then realized that the food that the soldiers were being served was really not that great food. So she would try and clean up the food. And she would establish what's known as the diet kitchen. And she was actually given an appointment as state sanitary agent. And that way, that's how she went through the military hospitals and also worked in the kitchens and tried to clean up the kitchens. One small brief note, and this basically links to Annie Wittenmeyer. One of the things that when the military was really pressed for food and tried to stretch out food, one of the things they did, and I read it in two different books. I don't know how it happened, but anyway, I read it in two different books. The military was known to put wood shavings into like a soup or like a stew to like thicken it up. I don't even want to go there. But anyway, that is why Annie Wittenmeyer had to go clean up the kitchens and basically create kind of like a diet kitchen. Anyway, an example of another government girl would be Clara Barton. Clara Barton actually got a job in the U.S. Patent Office. And so she worked in a patent office. And then she realized that the military really needed to have supplies. So in a sense, she worked her day job. And then when she had time off, she volunteered to bring supplies to various troops. Obviously in her area, but she made several trips. She would constantly make trips, basically trying to bring supplies to the military. She will eventually be appointed a sanitary commission position. And so she was able to then really kind of work full time working with the military and help supply the military. But she did a lot of things. She did more than just bring supplies. When she would bring supplies to the military, she would talk to the soldiers. She would go into military hospitals and talk to the soldiers, write letters for soldiers who couldn't do that, and just kind of provided kind of that extra little, you know, take care, how are you doing type of care for the soldiers. Now, also, I'm going to talk about Clara Barton, and this actually is going to happen at the end and the beginning, or at the end of the Civil War. She and a friend are going to go to Switzerland, so she's definitely middle class to be able to go to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, she's going to discover what's known as the Red Cross organization, and she's really taken by this Red Cross organization. So she basically, when she comes back to the United States, that's basically going to be her work. She's going to create the American Red Cross, and she'll actually create the American Red Cross in 1882. All right, now supplying the Union, medical personnel. Many women basically donated their time to be nurses. So when you talk about nursing for the Civil War, it's a lot of different things. You can have women that will just volunteer to be nurses, and they'll go out to field hospitals, or they'll go to like makeshift hospitals, and they will basically volunteer their services and volunteer them being nurses, not having formal training, okay? But the military knows that they need this, so they will actually create nurses training program, because they wanted to have some kind of uniformity type of knowledge, that type of thing. So they're going to enlist Elizabeth Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell was a doctor, and they will actually enlist Elizabeth Blackwell in creating a nursing training program for women to become nurses, so then they could take care of Union soldiers. Now, this is a really great thing, because the nurses, it's kind of hit and miss. You usually got paid, but there's some documentation where women will say, I really wasn't paid, but you'll also see documentation where women did get paid. So I realize it's not about the money, but it's the fact that some women did get paid. But what it's actually going to do is it's actually going to really solidify nursing as a career for women. And nursing as a career for women is going to take off after the Civil War. And if you've been through a nursing training program for the Civil War, it is very easy for you to get a job, and it's basically kind of like this automatic in after the Civil War. And it just kind of opens up a new field for women, obviously, which women will go to in droves and numbers. Okay, now getting back to the nursing during the Civil War. Our good friend Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix will become superintendent of nurses. And so she did a lot of the recruiting for women to get them to recruit women into the nursing programs. Now, okay, don't pass any judgments here. I'm just telling you about historical things. When Dorothea Dix basically was doing recruiting, she was kind of specific about the women she recruited. She wanted 30 years or older, and she also wanted women plain in appearance. Okay, I took that directly from a book. Now, and the whole idea is, her thinking was that the pretty young women would cause problems with the soldiers. So she was definitely looking for a certain type of nurse. Anyway, after the war, and this is what I kind of mentioned about the pay. After the war, some nurses were compensated about $12 per month, but that was definitely hit and miss. Okay, another woman in the medical service, Mary Edward Walker. Mary Edward Walker was a physician at the time of the Civil War, and she will actually be the first female to be considered to be what's known as assistant surgeon for the Union. And she acted as a surgeon during the war years. Now she's going to be, her title is assistant surgeon because she's a woman, Okay, but she basically acted as a doctor, acted on her own, and was a surgeon during the war. She was actually awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor for her services. So she will be the first woman to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor from the federal government. But it was actually rescinded because they said that she was doing women's work during the Civil War. So they awarded it to her, and then they actually rescinded it, and they actually took it back. So she, during her lifetime, will actually never get the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, in 1919, there's going to be this kind of movement to actually get her medal, to get her award in her honor, and she will actually be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously in 1919. So once again, she's still the first woman to have a Congressional Medal of Honor. And I believe I should go look that up. There's only very few women who have the Congressional Medal of Honor. Right off the top of my head, I'm going to say 3, but don't hold me to that number. But it's actually very few, even in modern time. Now, one other thing I want to point out, with her getting the award posthumously in 1919, you also have to remember that at that point in time, there's a huge movement for the women's right to vote. And the women were really big, and there's a huge movement at that point in time. And they will actually get the right to vote in 1920. So I don't think that it is a coincidence that there are women within that movement that are going to be fighting for this honor for her posthumously. Okay, other services that women will do during the Civil War. Women were known to act as spies, couriers, guards, as informants, however you want to say it. And they were in a really good position for it, because if you're at home, or you have to go to the grocery store, or go to the general store, or you're going to be out and about a little bit, or maybe you're just in the farm, and you kind of see movements, and then you can kind of play dumb if you're in the middle of town. You're like, oh, I don't know anything, I'm just going to the store. And then what happens is they come back home, and then they go back, and then they tell whatever army, whatever side they're on, and they'll say, oh, I saw A, B, and C, and they can actually tell them what they saw. And women were known to do that a lot. When you talk about couriers, it was also known for women to take information across enemy lines. Once again, they could kind of play dumb with it. Like, oh, I'm just, I know, but I have to go to, this town, and I have to, I don't know, visit somebody or whatever. And women could kind of play the woman card and go, kind of play dumb, and I don't know. And in actuality, she knows exactly what she's doing. It was done on both sides. Okay. Spies. You can also have women that were spies, and there were spies definitely on both sides of the war. And I will, okay, no, I'm trying to think of her name. Mary Bauer. Mary Bauer is considered to be, I think they call it intelligence officer or something like that. But she really was a spy. Mary Bauer was an African American, and she was a housekeeper for Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and he was in Richmond, Virginia at the time. And Mary Bauer was basically his slave, and she was basically a housekeeper. And she was literate, and so when she was in his office, she would, be cleaning his office, and she would memorize paperwork that was on his desk. And then she had some contact with the Union, and she would basically tell them everything that she read on his desk. And so she actually was a spy, and a spy, informant, however you want. And she actually, on her gravestone, will say, I think she's referred to as like an intelligence officer or intelligence, something like that. But she was definitely a spy on that. So that's one story. Okay, now, this is the other one. Elizabeth Van Lew, Lew. Elizabeth Van Lew posed as Crazy Bet. That was what she was known to by regulars. And she basically helped rescue Union soldiers from a Richmond prison. And she definitely was a spy. So she would do that, and she would also bring information. But one of the things she was known for was to rescue soldiers from a Richmond prison. Okay, now let me see if I have it. I have that one. I have one other woman that I'm thinking of. Rose Greenhow. Rose Greenhow was a spy for the Confederacy. And she was basically passing on information. Now she will be arrested. She'll be caught by the Union, and she'll be arrested in 1862. And she will actually go to prison. And she'll be in prison for the rest of the Civil War. She'll be in the prison in Washington, D.C. Now, when the Civil War is over, she will be released, and she'll just go back home into the South. But that's another example. She got caught doing it. But another example of women being spies. Okay, another one. Women would pick up weapons and fight to defend their territory. And that was actually, I would say, relatively common. If fighting came into their area, women would basically say, I'm going to defend my home and I'm going to defend my land. And so they would pick up weapons and they would fight just to defend their land, their community, their city. And women were definitely known to do that. But it's not necessarily that they followed the soldiers once the fighting was over from that community. Okay? Now, however, there actually were women that would pick up weapons in different ways. There were women that actually disguised themselves as men because they wanted to serve their country. And they would actually disguise themselves as men, and they would actually fight. Now, the women usually did not make it through the entire Civil War. Usually they're found out some way, shape, or form. But you actually have some women that actually will serve for approximately like 2 years before they were actually found out. I know that sounds crazy, but every once in a while it will happen. I actually have pictures of those women on the PowerPoint. One of the problems, or one of the biggest problems, is that when, and an example of one woman, when she's fighting as a man, she'll actually be hit and she'll actually have a wound. And when they go to actually give her medical care, they were surprised to find out that she was a woman. But anyway, just examples of women participating in the Civil War in various ways, shapes, or forms. Okay, African-American women. Once again, African-American women are going to take up the cause of the Union and support the Union. And they were all there to support the Union because they wanted to end slavery and support the abolitionist cause. In the North, African Americans helped by providing supplies, being a part of organizations that would raise money to basically create supplies so they could send it to the troops. When you do have fighting for the Civil War, you'll have fighting of African-American men will be fighting in the Civil War. They're fighting in segregated units. And so it'll actually be the African-American women that will basically tend to the African-American males that are wounded. And this is, in a sense, another sad story, if you think about it, is because the African-American soldiers weren't getting that much care at a basic military hospital because they were Black. And so they would get more care if you had African-American women that would then go in there and care for them as nurses. So they definitely did that, and that was one way to support the war. Talking about that. Now, in the South, okay, African-American women in the South for the Confederacy. African-American women were known to try to disrupt plantation work. Some ran away. It was actually very easy to run away, whether you're male or female, to run away because people really aren't watching you. And so they would basically be able to slip away, if you will. There's going to be in 1863, you're going to have the passage of what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation Act. And this granted slaves their freedom, and it granted the slaves their freedom in the Confederacy, in any state not held by the Union, so anywhere in the Confederacy. So by 1863, the slaves were free. And so the slaves then, or now former slaves, freedmen, freedwomen, at that point in time, they called you a freed man, whether you're a man or woman. A freedman is a man or a woman. Now that they're free, they have options. They could basically go up north and basically find a life, create a life in the north, find family, find friends. Some moved around the south looking for disrupted families. They all looked for some type of education. But some, crazy enough, will actually stay where they are. On the plantation, they'll say, this is my home. I don't know any other home. I don't know how else, I don't know what else I'd do. And so they would actually stay. And sometimes they would say, well, there's no way the missus could run this plantation. Like, she doesn't know how to run it. And at least we can run the plantation. So once again, it's now a very personal decision on what the freedmen are going to do. And they do a lot of different things. They can also look for work where they could get pay. If they do get paid, it would definitely be very low. But you got to remember, it's a Civil War. Not a lot of that is happening at that point in time. They are looking for educational opportunities, especially if they go north. They are looking for educational opportunities. Now, a woman, African-American woman, a woman from Georgia, her name was Susie Taylor, went to work for the Union Army. So she went to work for the federal government. She basically she worked as a nurse, she worked as a laundress, and she took care of African-American soldiers. She'll also try to encourage African-Americans to enlist into the Union Army. And then on her free time, whenever she had free time, she would also teach African-American children. So Susie Taylor must have been educated, or at least had some type of basic education. She'll also work with Clara Barton during her time for the Civil War. Another woman, Carlotta Fortin, a free African-American woman from Philadelphia. She's part of the Fortin family that I had mentioned in an earlier video. Carlotta Fortin is a free African-American from Philadelphia. She served as a teacher and a journalist for the Atlantic Monthly. And she was definitely there to try and teach African-American children and even older adults that needed just basic literacy. Another woman, Mary Ann Carey, C-A-R-Y, she enlisted African-American volunteers into the Union Army, so she worked for the federal government, and it's actually documented that she actually was paid. It was a paid position. So that's Mary Ann Carey. She enlisted African-American volunteers into the Union Army, so she was paid by the federal government. All right, now another woman. We've already talked about Harriet Tubman. She was a part of the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, she's going to run a few missions that basically supplied Union troops. So she will actually, because she knows the South so well, so she will actually run some missions. In some books, she is listed as a spy, probably because of running those missions and getting supplies to the Union Army. But she also worked as a nurse. She worked as a nurse in South Carolina, taking care of the African-American men. Once again, you have to have African-Americans take care of African-American men, which is really sad. But anyway, Harriet Tubman knew a lot of herbal medicine. So she will basically, when she's taking care of the African-American soldiers, she will basically use her herbal medicine knowledge to basically help them recover and help them get better. She's also listed as a laundress also, but a lot of times if you're a nurse, a lot of times they'll say nurse and laundress in kind of the same position. Talked about that. You have the Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., there was what was known as a Contraband Relief Society. And you'll have many refugee former slaves all go into Washington, D.C., and they need basic supplies. And so you had this, what was called the Contraband Relief Society, definitely run by African Americans, trying to support kind of the newly freed slaves that are coming into Washington, D.C. during the war. You will also see schools that will be set up, Washington, D.C., but definitely in the north, and that's to provide education for the newly freed, or the freedmen. Okay, now the Confederacy. This is just overall women, just overall general in the Confederacy. Women provided supplies, sewing, food for the Confederate troops. They would organize some like benefit fairs or concerts to raise money. That was definitely a struggle, okay, because there's not a lot of money in the Confederacy. The inflation rate is extremely high in the Confederacy, so raising money is actually extremely difficult. But they're doing their best. They're, trying to sew uniforms, darn socks, that type of thing, bring some food to the Confederate soldiers, trying to get supplies to them. Medical personnel. Women in the South, they definitely acted as nurses. There's no like nurses training program for the Confederacy. Women just volunteered as nurses to basically care for the wounded. In the South, especially with the very large homes and the very large plantations, women would open up their plantation houses, and they would be basically kind of hospitals, makeshift hospitals. And they would just get kind of the ladies in the community to help take care of the soldiers. Some women were a little concerned about being a nurse because they might see some private parts of the men. So in the South, women would do as much as they would feel comfortable with. Some women would say, I want to help out, but I don't want to do any of that stuff. So I'll help feed them, I'll write letters for them. So women did different things of whatever they were comfortable doing. But if it's dealing with the family member, usually women just, kind of got in there, rolled up their sleeves, and would do everything and anything for a family member if that was the case to be. As I mentioned, other services for women, they would do the same thing as the other women in the North, acted as spies, couriers, informants. This is the Rose Greenhow, that she was a spy for the Confederacy. Belle Boyd was a spy and a courier, but she also was caught. And she also was caught in '62. And so, as I have it written here, is that she was betrayed and was caught. So you do have women in the Confederacy that definitely acted as spies. So anyway, and once again, women in the South pitched in for wherever the men weren't there. And so they were running the plantations, they were running the family farms, they were running the businesses, they were trying to maintain the household. And it was, I would say, more difficult in the South than in the North, only because majority of the battles were fought in the South. So there's going to be far more destruction. Towns and cities are going to have a huge amount of damage and bombing. And so their plantations and their farms are basically being taken out because of the fighting and the bombing during the Civil War. So it definitely was far more challenging for women in the South to basically try to survive and to survive the family farm and the family business. Definitely very challenging. All right, that is my lecture on the Civil War. There are, as always, more lectures to come.